Cynthia Boaz is an assistant professor of political science at Sonoma State University, where her areas of expertise include political development and quality of democracy, nonviolent conflict and nonviolent struggle, and political communication, with an emphasis on media coverage of war. Her work has appeared in numerous academic journals, including Peace Review, a journal of social justice, Feminist Media Studies, Comparative Political Studies, and Sojourners magazine. She has also contributed chapters to several books on nonviolent action and social movements. Professor Boaz is an affiliated scholar at the UNESCO Chair of Philosophy, MA program in Peace, Conflict, and Development Studies in Castellón de la Plana, Spain. She is also on the board of directors at the Meta Center for Nonviolence Education and at the Project Censored Media Freedom Foundation. She was also recently appointed to the board of advisors for Truthout, for whom she is also a contributing writer. Boaz is also a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, where she often writes about challenges to and quality of democracy in Iran and the United States. Boaz is the associate editor of Peace and Change Journal, the collaborative journal of the Peace History Association and the Peace and Justice Studies Association. She was the opening speaker at the 2009 M.K. Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence annual conference at the University of Rochester, and in the past several weeks, she has led workshops or given talks on nonviolent action in India, Vancouver, Boulder, New Orleans, San Francisco, and Atlanta. Boaz has recently been referenced or interviewed for her knowledge on strategic nonviolent conflict, and particularly Burma's Saffron Revolution and Iran's Green Revolution, by international media including BBC and the International Herald Tribune. Last October, she interviewed Iranian Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi about the woman-led movement in that country. Boaz remains an activist working with several international human rights organizations, such as the U.S. Campaign for Burma. With that, it is now my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Cynthia Boaz.
Thank you, Jake. First of all, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this became a project for me, and then introduce some general concepts, and then we'll dive into the content. This is the early stage of a book project that I'm beginning for the University of Queensland Press. So the presentation that you'll be getting today is the preliminary presentation that the publishers received as well. And so I'd be very happy to get your feedback and questions on the themes of framing and how they relate to civil resistance and the perceptions that we have about how civil resistance and nonviolent action works. So this analysis that I'm going to discuss today was originally prompted back in the fall of 2007 as I was following the coverage of the unfolding events in Burma's Saffron Revolution. And as I was watching the pictures of the monks pouring into the streets of Rangoon and Mandalay, and then hearing the reporters' analysis of what those pictures meant, a question occurred to me, which was, does the perception of failure of a struggle contribute to actual failure? And then, the corresponding question would be, does perception of success contribute to actual success? So to the degree that either of those things can be answered yes, as people sympathetic with nonviolent struggles and movements, I began to assume that we have an obligation to see that these events are covered accurately and that they're covered comprehensively and within context by the various media. And so if you go back and track the ways in which both print media and television media coverage different occurrences of nonviolent action, you'll see just at first glance, even given a very cursory overview, that most of the stories are dedicated to the violence, to the crackdowns, and to the repression in the stories, rather than the resistance and the dynamics of the struggle. So the question of why does this happen, and what does it mean, and then furthermore, what can we do about it, is really the essence of this work. I also want to mention that when I introduced this topic at the International Peace Research Association conference in Australia last summer, my presentation corresponded with the launching of a book by Johan Galtung on peace journalism. And at the book launch for that book, he talked a little bit about what he had discovered in the research and the gathering of the data for that book, that really looks at some of the same kinds of themes that I look at, but his focus is more on times of war and conflict, whereas mine is particularly on nonviolent movements. But what he discovered was, when he looked at the question of what makes news, he learned that number one, whatever makes news must first of all be negative. Number two, that there must be an actor behind the negativity, as opposed to a structure. So he argued that there has to be an individual around whom you can tell this negative, sad story. Thirdly, he discovered that in order to make the news, the story really has to focus on events in or related to elite countries, so wealthy, influential states, or elite persons. And then in order to get news coverage and make it to the top of, above the fold, as we say, in terms of media coverage, there's a ratio of how many folks in non-elite countries have to be killed or maimed or be involved in some sort of tragedy before they get the equivalent amount of coverage as an American. And the ratio that he discovered was 10,000 to 1. So for example, there would have to be 10,000 Somalis killed in order to get the same amount of coverage that one American who was killed would get through most of international mainstream sort of media. So all of this connects to this larger theme of framing, which is the purpose of and the lens of this research. I'm interested in looking at how frames are created and how we gather meaning from them. So to introduce the concept of framing, I refer to a linguist named George Lakoff from UC Berkeley, who's written pretty prolifically over the last decade about the role of frames in Americans' understanding of our own politics and political discourse. So he describes frames as the mental structures that allow human beings to understand reality and sometimes to create what we take to be reality. And he says they structure our ideas and concepts, they shape how we reason, and they even impact how we perceive and how we act. And for the most part, our use of frames is unconscious and automatic. We use them without even realizing it. So this is an attempt using the phenomenon of nonviolent action to help us as global citizens and consumers of media to become more conscious of these frames. So to go back to the story of Burma for a second, back in the fall of 2007, by that first week of October, as Burmese students and monks and citizens who were still hoping for an end to the decades of austerity and repression in Burma, continued taking to the streets in what has since been named the Saffron Revolution. Despite the threats of violence from the regime and its security forces, much of the international media had already designated that uprising a failure. News stories began to acknowledge the regime's claim to be restoring order and the regime's promise that life in Burma would soon be, quote, returned to normalcy. Now, anyone familiar with the story of Burma knows that life for the Burmese people has not for many decades been normal or orderly. But that reality did not seem to faze many of the journalists who were covering the story, most of whom were forced to rely almost exclusively on the regime for information on events transpiring in the streets of Rangoon and elsewhere. But inside the country, activists had a very different story to tell. And from their vantage point, it was actually they who were attempting to install, for the first time in many decades, normalcy and order to Burmese society. So the frames on the story that emerged in international media, even before the public resistance within the country was completely quashed, tended to reinforce a number of common beliefs, what I would call misconceptions, about power, violence, and the relationship between the two. And those misconceptions, which also, I would argue, can unconsciously serve the interests of the oppressors and of those committing the injustices, are sustained largely by deeper meta-messages that audiences receive when they're reading or watching news coverage of conflict. So as media audiences and observers relying on other people's accounts of nonviolent struggles, we tend to face a number of challenges in obtaining a nuanced understanding of the dynamics underlying civil resistance. So, do these misconceptions explain the Burmese movement's inability to bring about a victory in the fall of 2007? Probably not. But no struggle succeeds, as we know, without the sympathy of the larger majority. And so while the international audience can't win Burma's struggle for them, or any other people's struggle, it's difficult to imagine a scenario where the Burmese people could win without the solidarity of the global media audience. And that's something that's unattainable outside of an accurate and comprehensive portrayal of the struggle by journalists and reporters. So on this next slide, I've listed 5 of the most common misconceptions that are derived from media coverage and framing of nonviolent movements and action. And I'm going to presume that because this is an audience that's already had significant introduction to the dynamics of nonviolent action, that we don't need to go into too much depth about how to correct these misconceptions, but I will just say a little bit about each of them. because these are the ones that, in looking at coverage of the various struggles that I'm gathering data for in this book, these are the ones that come up the most frequently. So the first is that nonviolent action is inaction, or the avoidance of conflict, or passive resistance. So as you all know, this is an erroneous assumption that nonviolent action is actually a very proactive phenomenon, that it's the waging of conflict nonviolently. And that is a misconception that is very difficult to get around in terms of how pervasively it's framed, because there's a saturation effect with the term nonviolence and with the term nonviolent, where these are very loaded kinds of terms in the public mind. So there's an assumption that when you use the term like nonviolent, it means non-action. And so even the most well-intentioned journalists are going to have difficulty getting around that misconception and giving a contextualized picture of what nonviolent action is, because of the embeddedness of misbeliefs, misconceptions about that term. The second prevalent misconception is that nonviolent action is only used as a last resort. And as many contemporary movements have discovered, nonviolent action need not, and in fact should not, be used as a last resort. And we understand this is for a couple of reasons. On one hand, activists and movements who are attempting to adhere to the Gandhian or Kingian understanding of nonviolent action realize that means and ends are inseparable, so that a state of justice can't be manifested from an unjust process, or that, put it another way, that a nonviolent structure can't emerge from a violent waging of a conflict. And then secondly, that we also know that recent empirical studies have demonstrated that democracies that were established through mass nonviolent civic action, rather than armed insurrection or external intervention, are much less likely to be susceptible to democratic backsliding and are more likely to result in healthy systems. The third misconception that we get a lot in media coverage about these different movements, oh sorry, I didn't realize I was doing these out of order, is that the effectiveness of nonviolent action is a function of the ideology or repressiveness of the opponents. That's also, I think, similar to the fourth, which is that the occurrence of nonviolent action is determined by culture or other structural conditions. And both of those are addressed in an emerging subfield of research on really what amounts to a structure versus agency kind of question in nonviolent action, and a subfield that I'm guessing you've already been introduced to. It's also sometimes called the skills versus conditions argument. But the brief response to this misconception is that given the universe of successful stories of nonviolent action, there seem to be no structural conditions that are clearly prohibitive of nonviolent success, and conversely, there are no structural conditions that guarantee nonviolent success. So rather, the success or failure of nonviolent movement seems to be much more dependent on the strategic skills and discipline of the movement itself. And the repressiveness of the opponent would be one of those structural conditions that is not prohibitive. And then the final common misconception is that nonviolent campaigns need a charismatic leader to succeed. And you'll see this misconception being reinforced, especially in the 24-hour cable news networks coverage of uprisings around the world. I'm thinking of U.S. mainstream media like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, because when they're covering things like the uprising that took place last summer in Iran, for example, they're always looking around to see who's leading, who's responsible for this uprising. And if they can't identify a leader, then they assume that what they're looking at is chaotic or ad hoc. But there's a couple of erroneous assumptions built into that misconception. One is the belief that in order to succeed, a movement needs its own Gandhi or king. We know that that's not essential, and that having a charismatic leader can actually work against the movement in a couple of ways. Namely, because the vesting of so much authority in one person could be devastating to the organization and the morale if that individual is removed somehow from the dynamic. And then there's also, of course, the danger that of the movement coming to identify with a persona rather than the larger unifying principles. So, the counter to that misconception would be that, yes, while it's critical that a successful strategic movement have good leadership, it doesn't need to take the form of one charismatic persona. So these are some of the common but far from only misconceptions that are reinforced in the various coverage that we get about these uprisings going on around the world. And so I'll return to these a little bit later in the presentation. But now I want to ask you to take a look at this photo from the 2007 uprising in Burma, a photo that is probably familiar to most of you. So unfortunately, most of this audience is already primed, having likely seen this picture. But let's play along, and let me ask you, if you were seeing this photograph for the first time, emerging from the events in the fall of 2007, what would you see without any additional context, without a caption, without any additional commentary? When you look at this picture, this moment where Burmese Buddhist monks are juxtaposed with security forces, who is confronting whom in this picture in your mind? What are the other implicit assumptions that you make? So, for example, when you look at this picture, do you see organized action, or do you see spontaneous action? Do you first notice victims, or do you see empowered action takers, or for that matter, do you see repressors? Do you see chaos or strategy? Do you see hope or demoralization, violence or nonviolence, or do you see success or failure? So, to the extent that we, as the media audience, make any of those assumptions as we're looking at a picture like this, those assumptions are largely driven by pre-existing hardened beliefs, what I call in this work metaframes, deeply embedded, almost universal statements about elements of reality that then emerge or manifest in media coverage of the phenomenon. So as I mentioned earlier with the story about Burma, the gap between the ways in which media frames stories emerging from places like Burma, Iran, Honduras, Gaza, and elsewhere. And the reality on the ground for the activists inside the country is sometimes very significant, even shocking. So on one hand, while media can serve the purpose of telling us the story and helping to create and promote understanding of the dynamics of a struggle, erroneous media frames can unintentionally reinforce key distortions in our knowledge about struggles. And this is where it gets problematic. They can even default to the perspective of the oppressor and thereby undermine the movement or the campaign and unwittingly enable brutality and repression to be ongoing. Okay, so I'm going to return for a second here to the concept of framing, and then I'll move into a few specific techniques or tactics of framing, ways in which media actually go about the process of creating frames. So a media or conceptual frame helps form the cognitive structure around our perceptions of reality, and it determines which parts of a news story we find most significant. It also determines which ones we tend to ignore. And it helps us draw subconscious but often deeply embedded conclusions about the meaning behind the events in the story. Now, because in general media tend to be so obsessed with violence and repression, the context and the significance underlying the series of events, like the ones that took place in Burma in the fall of 2007 or in Iran in the summer of 2009, are often misinterpreted. It tends to be that, more often than not, that the wrong or less interesting but more sensational elements of the story are emphasized while others are downplayed. And as a result, erroneous or incomplete conclusions emerge. And often these conclusions can have the consequence of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, for example, think about what happens when Iranian pro-democracy activists, say, who are in the middle of an uprising, catch a glimpse of a CNN streaming headline that says, Ahmadinejad victorious in Iranian elections, or that refer to Mousavi as the defeated challenger, and that these frames are emerging at the height of the resistance to what is understood within the movement, within the struggle, to be a stolen election. Activists are likely to see these sorts of frames and then conclude that the regime's attempt at a coup has succeeded. And this in turn would dampen enthusiasm and morale, which would then in turn cause some in the movement to give up their resistance, or worse, could cause others to turn to violent means as a last desperate resort to fight back. Although occasionally media frames are like this, erroneous or questionable media frames are consciously manufactured, and I would point to the example of Murdoch's Fox News Channel for an example of that. Conventional wisdom suggests that for the most part, the major culprit is the inability or unwillingness of reporters to engage in serious, investigative, or assiduous on-the-ground reporting. And so this can be extraordinarily frustrating for members of a nonviolent democracy struggle who, in addition to everything else, find themselves in the midst of an uprising, having to try and unspin erroneous or incomplete media coverage coming from all kinds of directions. Okay, so this is the first of 4 specific framing techniques that I'm going to talk about briefly. The first one is fragmentation, or sometimes we call it the fragmentation bias. The fragmentation bias involves covering the news story in isolated, seemingly unrelated pieces. So at its worst, a story would be completely removed of its larger historical or political context. And as they were being reported, sorry, start that sentence over again. As the stories from Iran in the summer of 2009 were being reported by most American mainstream media, for example, they were largely fragmented. They suggested pandemonium. They suggested isolated acts of extremist political violence and a regime struggling to normalize the situation. So when taken together, and especially with the corresponding photographs, these smaller stories paint a picture of, in that case, a country in chaos, prone to violent theocratic extremism, and awash in repression. Now, each of these conclusions taken out of its context may have some veracity, but the larger reality is richer and also more potentially encouraging. So activists within Iran, for example, would argue that the Green Revolution is not just a series of ad hoc protests against a political theft, but a story of widespread resistance to ongoing repression. And would argue that it's not the repression and violence that's most interesting about the news that was coming from Iran during that period, but that people continued to resist despite that repression. So these are 3 headlines from various news networks, 2 American, 1 British, that illustrate the fragmentation bias just with the use of words in the form of a headline. So crowds join Ahmadinejad's victory rally, which defaults to the perception that Ahmadinejad has already won. Chaos prevails, implying that what's happening on the ground is disorganized, spontaneous, etc. Election battles turn into street fights, and again, re-emphasizing fragmentation, isolation, and a lack of context. The second type of media bias or technique that I'll mention is dramatization. And so stories that came from Iran last summer and fall, and stories from Burma in the fall of 2007 as well, were also characterized by this thing called the dramatization bias. The dramatization of a story occurs when news is encapsulated in sensationalistic bits that are intended to provoke an emotional response on the part of the news audience, but in the absence of larger, serious analysis of policy issues, of institutional interplay, or of the larger social setting. Dramatization thrives on confusion and skepticism and personalization, and it tends to lead to conclusions that are relatively cynical. So, for example, a dramatization bias might cover a massive protest against rigged votes as a, quote, spontaneous mass uprising, suggesting that it's not part of a larger systematic strategy and leading the media audience to conclude that it's just a one-time thing, that it's just a temporary and reflexive response to some immediate political crisis. And so, in turn, that kind of conclusion can go on to create a larger global perception that there's nothing, no movement, or no struggle with which the global audience can demonstrate solidarity. And so, for obvious reasons, that can be problematic. There also tends to be, with dramatization, an unconscious emphasis on the visual drama in a story, which can lead to sensationalizing the wrong parts of the story. And so this is where techniques like fear-mongering, the irrational promotion of ambiguous threat of fear is also seen. It's also, so fear-mongering falls into this category of dramatization. So these are a few headlines, 2 from Burma in the fall of '07, and then 1 from Iran last summer, that emphasize the use of the dramatization bias. So in the first one, you see the term extreme action ultimatum. The second, Burmese military threatens monks. The third, Iran's supreme leader condones violent police crackdown. Again, I want to emphasize that it's not that these kinds of headlines or the uses of these biases like dramatization or fragmentation mean that media is lying, or is even reporting events inaccurately, but just that there are very specific parts of the story that are overemphasized using these techniques, and other parts of the story that are either emphasized or under-acknowledged, or in some cases ignored altogether. Okay, the third media bias that I'll discuss is euphemism. Euphemism is interesting and very pervasive, and once you're primed for it, you begin to notice it everywhere. So euphemism involves the selecting of language to shift emphasis in the story, to distort meaning, or to downplay significance of key phenomena. Euphemism plays a dangerous role in the way that civil resistance is covered, and that's especially the case when the resistance takes place in a non-Western country. The terminology that's used to describe images of thousands of people on the streets will often connote improvised and anarchic forms of action, when in fact, in many of the cases, the movements themselves may be strategic, organized, and disciplined. For example, I remember a headline next to a picture of a massive demonstration that was taking place in Tehran, and the headline was on the MSNBC website, which within the context of American news media is considered to be one of the more liberal media networks, and therefore we would assume a little bit more sympathetic to mass nonviolent action. But this particular headline had a picture next to the picture of this crowd. That was Freudian. Next to the picture of this massive demonstration said, "Huge crowds in Iran." A statement which, while technically correct, was incomplete. And that's because the word crowd connotes any large group of people congregated together for no specific reason. But what was happening on the streets of Iran was much more sophisticated than a convergence of crowds. It was a massive, nonviolent uprising that everyone, except apparently many in American mainstream media, seemed to take seriously as a potential force for real change in Iran. And on the issue of euphemisms, I'd like to note that we also hear euphemisms a lot in describing situations of war. So terminology like collateral damage or smart bombs would be a couple of examples of euphemism that's used to sterilize or downplay some of the more brutal realities of war. There's also kind of an amusing story about how the Fox News channel early on after the invasion of Iraq sent out a memo ordering its reporters, its on-air reporters, to no longer use the word suicide bombers, but rather to use the term homicide bombers, because the memo argued that by using the term suicide bombers, there was an implicit legitimation of the grievances of the individuals engaging in that technique. So, and there's we could go on and on. There's numerous examples of euphemism. These are a couple that I just pulled out from the Burmese and Iranian cases. So the first from the Guardian UK tells us that 1 month on, the Burmese regime stages a show of strength. Now what's interesting is that that story was actually about repression. It went on to talk about how the junta had brutally cracked down on its monks, in some cases even killing several. This was before we knew how many had been killed. But the headline implies that rather than being a show of desperation or a response to being threatened by a movement, instead it just defaults to the idea that violence or repression is strength. And then another common euphemism that came up in both of these campaigns was terminology of restoring stability or restoring normalcy or restoring order. So that became a synonym for whenever we would see those regimes crack down on mass nonviolent civilian uprisings. And then the last form of media bias that I'll mention is called the authority disorder bias. The authority disorder bias is interesting because this is where, when media has information that's relatively sparse or of questionable veracity, they tend to default to the perspective of those in authority, to public officials, regardless of what's actually happening, so regardless of regime type or of ideology. So in many cases, the very entities that are responsible for the violence or for the chaos, the crisis, the repression, are also tasked implicitly or explicitly through the media framing techniques with fixing the crisis, with restoring order. So even when the phrasing is something like, the Iranian regime claims to be restoring normalcy, there's still an inherent default to accept the veracity of the claim, and that's especially the case when the story ends on that quote or by paraphrasing the perspective of the oppressor. I guess this gets into something I'll talk about in the last slide, but it was in terms of the authority disorder bias. What happened last summer regarding Iran was that, on one hand, entities like CNN were defaulting to the perspective of Ahmadinejad or those in the Guardian Council to tell us about what was happening inside the country, but the citizens, the activists, wouldn't have it. And ultimately what they did was they found a way around that problematic framing and the use of that authority disorder bias by using the social media network, Twitter, and because of the volume of tweets that would come in essentially saying the same thing as each other, but different than what the regime was saying, they were fairly successful in reclaiming their own narrative and in rejecting some of the erroneous framing and power of this particular technique. So here are just a couple other examples of the authority disorder bias. Iran's supreme leader orders investigations into claims of vote fraud. So there you have the regime that itself is being accused of corruption, leading its own investigations. And then likewise, the Myanmar junta sets curfew, similar sort of phenomenon. So, in addition to these other techniques that I've just gone through and the pervasiveness of some of these misconceptions, there are a few other culprits that contribute to general misunderstandings about nonviolent action. So I think I already mentioned earlier, but a lack of assiduous on-the-ground reporting inside many of these countries or settings is one challenge. A general lack of understanding of the subject matter or expertise in civil resistance and the dynamics of nonviolent action generally is a problem. The lack of the grasp of a larger historical, political, or social context in which the resistance is taking place can be problematic. And then, there's a general, hopefully not too pervasive problem with intellectual or journalistic laziness and unwillingness of reporters who are covering the story to actually look at it from all of the perspectives, including the perspectives of the activists on the ground. And I would just add to that, to this list as well, that there's a trend, especially in American mainstream media, towards more generalists in working as professional journalists as opposed to specialists, and that also contributes to some of these problems. Earlier on in the presentation, I mentioned that there were these things called metaframes that underlie the story-specific frames about nonviolent action. So I'm just going to briefly say a couple words about these. Beyond the surface-level frames that, or what I was calling misconceptions that we get about these different campaigns of nonviolent action, we can also observe a number of deeper metaframes that emerge from patterns in media coverage of stories about nonviolent struggle. And so you can think of these metaframes as the larger assumptions that we make about concepts like power, conflict, violence, and that shape the lenses through which we draw conclusions and attribute meaning and significance. And so for our purposes, given the subject matter, the most relevant metaframes are, number one, the idea that repression is more interesting or more important than resistance. And a simple glance at a list of several hundred articles compiled from both of these struggles that I mentioned shows a clear bias towards headlines that mention repression or violence rather than resistance. And only a tiny sprinkling of headlines use terminology like movement or struggle. Most, when they do mention the perspective of the people in the story, of the activists, they use terms like protesters and uprising. And not a single one of the stories that I found from American mainstream media sources used terms like nonviolence or nonviolent. And then a second common metaframe is that power is top-down. This is pervasive, not just in media coverage of nonviolent action, but I think part of a collective consciousness. When I teach, for example, I ask students to define power. They always tend to define it as something that comes from the top and that happens to them or is exerted over them. And the next metaframe, that power is monolithic, goes hand in hand with that perception. And collectively, those frames, which are very deeply embedded, make it more difficult for us as media audience to interpret the events that we're seeing when we look at mass nonviolent resistance as a bottom-up sort of phenomenon. There's also the common metaframe that conflict itself is undesirable and something that needs to be quashed. And then also that violence is the most effective means of waging a conflict, something that I'm guessing maybe some of your earlier presenters have talked about as a common piece of conventional wisdom. So collectively, when you look at these metaframes and how they work, they lead the audience to default to a larger frame that victories for nonviolent movements, for civil resistance movements, are not in the hands of the movement, but in the oppressor, and that successful campaigns where they happen are accidents of history. So if you take a glance at these frames and think about them collectively, you can see that they are collectively very disempowering. And so because they're so deeply embedded, they're a lot more difficult to challenge in terms of the surface frames, but we have to start somewhere. So this brings me to the last part of the presentation, which is what can we as a conscious global media audience and global citizens do to counter disempowering frames. Number one, consume media more consciously, so be primed for and aware of framing when it's taking place. Go one step further to ask if the frame's assumptions are valid. Third, use accurate language consistently. And so this is especially relevant if you're taking on the role of citizen journalist, or if you're an activist involved in a struggle and are interested in telling your story, creating your narrative authentically. Remember to address both the surface framing, so those immediate story-level misconceptions and the deeper metaframes, those beliefs we hold about violence and power. And then lastly, I would reinforce the messages that I think were conveyed in Tuesday's presentation with Al Giordano about the role of media from below, authentic journalism, citizen journalism, and so on. The Green Revolution from Iran has also earned the nickname the Twitter Revolution for the role that Twitter played in dismantling some of the regime's messages and ultimately making them look pretty ridiculous. And in the Burmese case, video journalists played an important role in getting information out of that very closed country at a very critical time, helped to shape the global perspective, for only the second time really ever on what was really happening inside that country. So in conclusion, the Iranian, Burmese, and other stories of nonviolent action that have been covered in media over the last few years shouldn't be viewed as stories of successful repression, and nor are they stories about the obvious preference of Iranians or Burmese for autocracy. That's another set of frames that has emerged from a lot of these stories. Rather, these are stories about massive resistance to oppression and injustice, and responsible democratic media and conscious citizens should recognize and tell the stories that way, both on behalf of those who are doing the resisting and those who are doing the observing. So in the ideal, media coverage would tell these stories from the perspectives of those activists, and not simply from the perspective of the oppressors, the authority figures. And ultimately, activists and movements can begin to reclaim their own narratives and tell their own stories. That's it.
All right, Cynthia, thank you so much for your presentation. At this point, we're going to switch over to the question and answer session. So once again, if you'd like to ask a question for Cynthia, you can hit the raise hand button at the top left hand of your control panel. We just ask that you have your microphone ready. And if you don't have a microphone, you can actually type it into the questions pane, and I will read it for you. So if there's any questions at this point.
I'm sorry.
Jake,
Yes?
Jake, we have a question, or maybe questions coming from Slovenia, from Portorofos.
Okay.
Thank you, Jake. This is Malik from Slovenia, ICNC course. And thank you, Cynthia Boaz, for your nice presentation. I have a couple of questions from you. The first question is, media, especially being a strong player of change, whether it is playing a role of fourth pillar of a state, or its role is or should be a watchdog of the society in general and the government especially. How do you opine it? And the second question, shall I go for the second question?
Sure. I'd like to hear both.
Okay.
Although, can you repeat the first part of the first question? I heard you use the term fourth pillar, but I didn't hear what you said before that.
Yeah. Media, especially being a strong player of a change, whether it is playing a role of fourth pillar, and then you have already got it. The second question, the strong opposition of Ahmadinejad, orally and practically, towards the West vis-a-vis USA, is the only reason of much coverage of Mousavi's rallies and statements in the media. And the third question, how you would minimize the subjectivity of the media's group persons related to any issue vis-a-vis conflicts. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last question? How would I minimize coverage?
Yeah, the coverage of means the subjectivity, their own biasness, who owns the media's group.
Okay.
How do you, what you would suggest basically to minimize that, or how do you think of it? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, should I answer these questions now, or are we gathering?
We can probably collect a couple of more.
Okay.
There is one more coming.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia, for this presentation. Let me first introduce myself. This is Karim from Egypt, and one of the attendees of the ICNC course. Moving to the question, how do you see, regarding the media from below you mentioned, how do you see the influence of the WikiLeaks latest releases regarding Iraq and those who were involved in the corruption, precisely the US, Iran, and the Iraqi government? And I guess one of the things that I got out of this course is that the media could play a role in combating either it could be used as a way of resistance against corruption and against kind of authoritarian regimes. So this is mainly my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there more? Should I take more, or should I?
Yeah, I think, Cindy, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. 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 I will. Was it Malik? Is that the first questioner's name? Is that correct? Okay. I'll just go ahead with the questions in order. So the first question was about, given that media is a strong pillar of change, do I see media as a fourth pillar, or should media act as a watchdog of government? So again, it's a question about media's role generally. So I'm going to answer this from the perspective of citizen and occasional media contributor living in a democratic society. So I just want to add that caveat before I give my response. I understand media, the role of media to be to act as the channel or vessel through which information is exchanged in a societal context or setting. So at whatever level that might be, local, national, global, etc. So I see the primary function. I see the primary function for media to be, at a very basic level, the means through which people get information that they need in order to act as democratic citizens if they're living in a democratic society, and if not, as global citizens, people who see themselves as in solidarity with others who may be struggling or suffering. So I don't necessarily see media as inherently adversarial. I see it more as a set of tools than as an agent in and of itself. But I do think a critical role for media, both within democratic societies and non-democratic societies, should ideally be to act as a watchdog, in the sense that those who are using the tools of media are are using them for their intended purpose, which is to check the power or potential abuses of governments and other oppressors, even corporations, for example. So I do agree that media is a pillar of change, and especially individuals acting within media, but I don't see media itself as inherently adversarial. I see media more as a set of tools that citizens, both national and global, require in order to actualize democracy, freedom, rights, dignities, and universal human rights. Let's see, the second question was about why it was that American media covered the pro-Mousavi rallies. I think the question was, do I explain the coverage of the Mousavi rallies because of the strong opposition to Ahmadinejad within the United States? That's how I understood the question, so I hope I'm getting it correct. The short answer to that is I do understand. I think that the intent behind the question, or the reasoning behind the question, but I don't believe that was the primary reason why Mousavi's rallies were covered. I do think opposition to Ahmadinejad reinforced the use of a lot of these framing techniques that I mentioned, and you know, in some cases may have underemphasized parts of the story or overemphasized parts of the story, but I think that the fascination with violence and repression and chaos on the part of media trumps the ideological opposition to Ahmadinejad and to the IRI generally. So in other words, I think it really was more about being able to talk about clashes on the ground, the use of violence, you know, and to paint a story of chaos, more than it was to privilege Mousavi over Ahmadinejad. I'm going to skip to the fourth question, and then I'll come back to the third. So the fourth question was from Kareem about how do I see the influence of WikiLeaks, especially the recent round of leaks. Can media play a role in combating corruption? Absolutely. WikiLeaks is a perfect example of how media as a tool can be used to resist untruths, disinformation, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, that is necessary to sustain repression or other sorts of injustices. So, so an entity like WikiLeaks, just by its very existence, really threatens the ability of regimes, including the United States in this case, to be able to control the story, to be able to control the public's perception of the truth behind what's really happened or happening and why. So I think we're just really beginning to scratch the surface in terms of how powerful entities like WikiLeaks can be, and I guess I would say how threatening they can be to to governments and authorities who need, for whatever reason, to be able to control the story, to control the narrative. And then the last question was about how would I suggest minimizing the subject, how would we go about minimizing the subjectivity, I guess the inherent bias in media coverage? I think that's a really good question. But I think it also implies that we can expect objectivity, which I don't think is necessarily borne out. I think that what we can expect is authenticity in telling a story, and I think this is what Al Giordano does, you know, with his media organization and the work that his journalists do, is in giving a bottom-up, genuinely grassroots, authentic version of the story, and as many versions of that as possible in any given context. I think that sort of storytelling, news delivery, is probably the healthiest way to try and address the subjectivity or bias problem in media. But you know, the idea of calling for neutrality or objectivity by different news entities, I think is just inherently problematic. I think it's possible to provide some degree of balance in storytelling, but unfortunately, because human beings are the ones through which stories are told, because we have lenses and frames already built in, I think we have to anticipate that there will always be some degree of subjectivity. So then the question becomes, how do we become conscious of that, and how do we build in as many and as authentic of perspectives as possible in order to get a comprehensive, contextualized, holistic view of the news story itself.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. At this point, we'll switch over to one of our listeners who's here in DC with our U.S. Institute of Peace course. Please go ahead, Michael Enright, with your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think Cynthia addressed one of my questions in the last comment, because I was reflecting that the slide where she showed the authoritarian bias was described by her in what I thought was sort of an anti-authoritarian bias, because both the government requesting a recount or the junta imposing a curfew were just statements of fact. They weren't statements of bias. They were factual from the words of any reporter who would say them, whether they believed that was how things should be or whether they believed that the regime shouldn't be allowed to ask for a recount, although I can't imagine anybody taking that position, or that a curfew is a bad thing to do in order to maintain order. So I think when we use the terms, or when we classify action, we have to say that it may very well have been legitimate from the point of view of the speaker or the storyteller, but it's only one aspect of the whole situation, which is the last thing Cynthia said. So maybe I don't have a question.
I would like to comment on that.
Please.
Yeah, I think that's a valid observation, and it's something that I've run up against in the gathering of media coverage for this project, because I have to recognize that in analyzing and interpreting these things that I'm perceiving as bias, I've got my own lens, you know, where I'm looking for that I'm using to look for and then draw conclusions about, you know, these stories with. So I think that it is correct to say that those headlines that I put up after I described the authority disorder bias I think they are statements of fact. That is correct. When taken with, the larger pictures that were being painted about the resistance and the campaigns that were going on in both of those, both of those countries at those different times, then I think there is, I think that that's where you can begin to pull out, a little bit of this, this defaulting to the regime or the junta being given the authority to tell the story. In other words, I don't think it's totally explicit, like CNN, an anchor saying, okay, we're going to turn it over to the IRI's information minister to tell us the truth about what's going on in Iran. But I think in the context of all of the larger information biases that were used over an extended period of time, reporting that the regime, simply reporting that the regime is investigating itself without providing more context is problematic.
All right, Macha, do you have any more questions from Slovenia? Are you there?
Yeah, do you hear me? Yes,
Yes.
We have one more question.
Okay. Speaking Rodina from Albania. The first question, would you rather find more obstructive or damaging for the public, but even for the media in itself, lack of transparency or maybe transmitting false information? The first one.
Okay.
Do you get me?
Yeah? I think so. Can you repeat that? Do I find it obstructive? Do I find that media is transmitting
obstructive false? Do you find obstructive or damaging for the public or media in itself the lack of transparency or giving or transmitting false information?
By media.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I understand.
The first question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the second one is why general media tend to be or to transmit the peak of movement, especially where violence is shown in these movements.
I'm sorry, you cut out again. Can you? I'm so sorry. I can't hear you very well. Can you say that again?
Yeah. Why media tends to transmit, okay, to give information when movement reaches its peak.
Ah, okay.
Okay?
Got it.
Especially where there are cases and violence is shown. All right?
Okay. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, Cindy, you can go ahead.
Okay, so on the first question, this is how I understood the question. That is it, do I find it to be obstructive or damaging for the public when there's a lack of transparency by media and when there's a transmission of false information and disinformation? That's how I understood the question. I hope that that's correct. And so my answer is absolutely yes. That's the foundation upon which I'm building this entire project. That in order to manifest our visions of things like freedom, democracy, the recognition of rights and dignity for people, the essence of all of these struggles that I'm looking at and that are taking place around the globe depend upon an open, transparent, and really authentic, comprehensive exchange of information and discourse. In other words, people both within the context of a struggle and outside of it, need to have an authentic sense of what's going on and why. So any form of propaganda or disinformation is going to be damaging to that process. So this project is an attempt, it's sort of a first stage of understanding how disinformation happens in ways that aren't blatantly propaganda, but can still be threatening to a movement. And then the second phase of the project is what we as citizens, activists, and people in solidarity can do about that in terms of promoting more transparency and more authenticity. And then the second question was about why does media tend to transmit information when a movement reaches its peak, especially its violent peak. And my answer to that is that there is a real obsession on the part of at least American mainstream media and its audiences with violence itself. And I think that in large part this is attributed to some of those metaframes that I mentioned in the presentation, beliefs about violence as being more interesting, and beliefs that violence reflects power and that sort of thing. But I also think that there's a simpler and maybe even more cynical explanation, which is that violence sells, and in the United States, media is a business for the most part. It's a for-profit entity, and so that presents a real challenge to getting out quality, but less, sometimes what is regarded as less interesting or less provocative information, but information that's necessary for an informed citizenship nonetheless. So yeah, I think that profit motive and the fact that media within the U.S. is largely privatized and regards violence as a product that could be sold also presents a serious challenge. And so that's why we get this, we get this distorted view of movements being the sum total of the one big uprising that takes place in the city square and then the repressive response to that. And I think that that's unfortunate.
All right, thank you so much, Cynthia. We've just crossed the hour-and-a-half mark, so I think if there's no more urgent questions, we'll start to wrap this up. So if there's any other final comments you'd like to make, Cynthia, please go ahead. Or go ahead, Maciej.
First of all, oh, yeah, go ahead, Maciej.
I just wanted to ask my students whether they have exhausted all the questions. It seems like. So Cynthia, you can go ahead and wrap up your presentation.
Okay. First of all, thank you for bearing with me for the last hour and a half. This was really helpful to me, and so I hope that it was helpful for you all as well. And in concluding this discussion about media framing and the role of media in covering nonviolent action and civil resistance, I just want to make two final recommendations or reminders. Number one, to be conscious consumers of media. So, to really think about the frames and the perspectives, the assumptions that are made in both the surface frames and the meta frames in the stories that you're being told about civil resistance around the world. And I would also ask that we do this with all stories, not just stories related to nonviolent action. So we become much more proactive participants in the media process rather than sponges, simply people that are receiving information. And then along those same lines, I encourage everybody to really empower themselves using the various tools of media and technology at your disposal, and to become engaged, and to the extent that it's possible, in the discussions both locally and globally, and share whatever information you have from your context, your settings, with the rest of us. So I see a big potential for social media to continue to at least help spread the message about struggles and about resistance and about human rights campaigns going on around the world. And so I'd ask that we all take a more proactive role in that.
Thanks so much again, Cynthia, for your presentation. And if you have any further questions for her, you can post it to the e-classroom, and we'll give Cynthia access to that so she can answer those questions if she has any time for that.
And Cindy would like to also thank you very much for your presentation on our end.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's kind of late there, so thank you for staying with me.
We are holding there.
It's nice to hear your voice too, Maciej.
It was great to hear you as well.
All right, have a great class, the rest of your class, everyone.